This is The Hollow, a dark fantasy adventure written by Dean Dunakin and narrated by Louis Krahn.
Part 2, The Old Road. Chapter 8, Coffee. The smell of coffee seeped into his consciousness before his eyes opened, and he smiled at the darkly sweet scent edged with a slight earthiness. When it unexpectedly skewed towards rancid, Noom wrinkled his nose and opened his eyes. It was just before morning. Sunlight barely hinted at in the cracks around the windows. He saw the coffee pot steaming over the fireplace, and from the faint glow of the embers, he could just make out his companions all sleeping. Aiden was supposed to be on watch, but his large blanketed form was curled up facing the fireplace. Aiden must have been set on the coffee to ward off sleep, then dozed off. But what had he added to cause the rancid smell? Noom set up for a yawn and arm stretch. He nudged Omega awake and pointed at Aiden's sleeping form. She fluttered her eyes open, squinted, smiled, shook her head, then rolled her eyes before pulling on her goggles. She too wrinkled her nose and wafted her hand in front of her face. Noom gave her a commiserate look. She snuck over to surprise Aiden, carefully grasped his blanket, then whisked it off, saying, "Good?" She screamed and fell back, her shriek turning into a wail. Noom winced and shut his eyes at the sound, then withered in the overpowering smell of decay and rot. Forcing his eyes open, he saw Aiden's motionless form bloated with pus and death. Patches of his loosened skin stuck to the blanket and his face was stretched into an agonizing rictus. Noom wordlessly moved his mouth while Omega, with increasing volume, shouted, "No, no, no!" She flung her goggles off and threw her hands on the corpse. A deafening roar filled the room as she poured dark light into the decaying visage. To the left, Noom saw Dev sit up in terror with his hands over his ears. Noom sensed a blur behind him. He snapped around and was shocked to see Aiden struggling forward from the storage room toward Omega, plodding one foot in front of the other as though walking through an intense gale. The twisted body in front of Omega jerked, convulsed its limbs, and screamed silently. Through the horrible simulacrum of Aiden's ravaged visage, the open wounds attempted to seal, stretching the rest of its skin tight and dry around its bones. Its bloating reversed, redoubling the stench pouring into the room. The real Aiden barely inched closer. Noom shouted at Omega to stop, but the roar masked all sound, and she was oblivious to all but her ghastly task. He grabbed a piece of broken furniture and threw it at her. It bent in its trajectory and smashed against the fireplace. She glanced up when the splinters flew across her vision, then recoiled as the corpse snapped its arm up and gripped her. Noom heard himself shouting and extended, "Stop!" After the force and din in the room abruptly ended, the real Aiden fell forward onto the ground next to Omega. She felt the thump and screamed when she looked over and realized her mistake. The corpse was already rising, absent-mindedly dragging her up with its death-like grip. She and Aiden reached for one another, but failed to connect, and she was pulled away. Noom tried to break through his terror and fumbled out of his sleeping bag, but Dev had sprung into action first, grabbed his mace, and charged the grotesque visage. Aiden had grabbed Omega's hand by now. She was racked with shock and indecision, and futilely struggled against the corpse's strong hold. Dev swung at the creature, which reciprocated the attack using its free arm. Dev's flanged mace bit into the flesh of its arm and almost ripped its hand off, which now hung on the tendons. The corpse continued to flail the loose hand ineffectually slapping into Dev's shoulder. Noom had freed himself from his bedding and started his own charge. He made eye contact with Aiden, who in unspoken agreement braced his grip on Omega. Noom barreled his shoulders into the thing's chest, launching it backward into the fireplace and ripping its grip from Omega. Its dried body burst into flames, but it slowly rose and advanced back towards the group, seemingly oblivious to its predicament. Dev grabbed a shield off his pack and rushed to keep the thing at bay while Aiden carried Omega out of the building. Noom quickly gathered their belongings, making several trips in and out while Dev battled the creature. The room now aflame, Aiden rushed back in with his unsheathed sword. "Flee!" he shouted. Dev and Noom quickly retreated, and Aiden swung wide and low, crushing right through the burning thing's legs. It collapsed in a heap, vainly struggling to crawl towards the fleeing group as flames consumed it. Out in the clearing, the men coughed, and Aiden rushed to huddle over Omega, who kneeled catatonically, staring at the nearby line of trees. Noom pulled his sword from his pack and held watch over the inferno while Dev reassembled their gear. The building collapsed in on itself, driving smoke and debris across the field. Noom and Dev ducked and guarded their eyes while Aiden shielded Omega with his body. As the noise and dust settled, the remains of the farmhouse smoldered skyward, and Noom was satisfied it was over. Omega clutched Aiden and was cognizant enough to be sobbing. Noom flew off the handle at her. "What were you thinking, fool girl? Pumping all that dark light into that thing could have killed you." She sobbed and shielded her eyes. "I saw Aiden lying there dead, and I just wanted him not to be. There was so much dark light in there, I thought I could..." Noom accused her. "You could have siphoned the life out of..." "Lay off her!" snapped Aiden aggressively. Noom clamped up, ashamed of his fury, but terrified by the power he witnessed. While they all cooled off, Dev found Omega's goggles and tossed them to her. "Guess that's it for the coffee," he said seriously. They all slowly began chuckling at the grim humor. With the tension broken, they reassembled for their trek. Noom put away his sword and picked up his staff. It was blackened from rolling in ash, but not charred. He brushed it off and shouldered his bag. "I'm sorry, Noom. I didn't mean to hurt anyone," said Omega. "What was that thing? How did it get in?" asked Dev. Noom pursed his lips, addressing Omega. "You were understandably emotional, but out of control. From here on in, all of us, you especially, will suffer assaults on your expectations of reality. That creature was a revenant. It's a reflection or an echo of life. A malicious mirage of memory. I've seen them before." He choked up slightly in sorrow at his own memory and covered it up by clearing his throat. "I don't know if they truly have consciousness, so when you animated it, it probably didn't even know what evil to enact first." "So it was more frightened than we were?" asked Dev, confused. "Well, I wouldn't..." "Kidding." Dev slugged Noom on the shoulder, then pulled up his large pack and set off back to the main path. Noom barely heard him say, "No way it was more frightened than me." Aiden clapped him on the shoulder on his way past. "Good teamwork in there." Omega stepped in front of him. "Thanks for snapping me out of it. You're right about being out of control. I was confused and scared. I still don't know everything about what I see. From the moment you woke me up and I smelled the coffee, you looked normal and peaceful, but the room was so, I'll say, bright. I could barely see at first. I should have known something was wrong." Noom took a beat, contemplating her, then said, "Don't worry about it, kid. The Hollow's been around for centuries, and no one knows how it all works." Omega smiled. "So I'm at least a kid now, rather than just a girl?" "Like I said, kid, all of us are still learning, even me." He hitched up his pack, tapped his walking stick on the ground, and they set off after the others. Thank you for listening to this Ember and Sparks production. Click the box on the left to listen to the next chapter or the box on the right to see an overview of all chapters available for this story. Check out the links in the description to listen to this audiobook without interruption. And before you go, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to never miss a new story. See you soon.